Hello and welcome to Unit 5. Today we'll be talking about probably the most complex market type, which is oligopoly. We'll be talking about in this unit the neoclassical models of oligopoly, the Carnot model, the reaction curves, the Stackenberg model, the Bertrand model, Nash equilibrium, game theory, price rigidity, and why the demands curve in oligopolies is kinked. We'll be talking about collusion and cartels, and then we'll be doing a little bit of chatting about collusion amongst Chinese airlines, as well as the legislative steps that have been taken to prevent collusion. In this picture, I've put the Nigerian profits, bank profits in 2018. And as you can see, the top 5 banks probably made more profit than the rest of the banks put together. So this is a classical oligopoly. It means that, you know, many purchases that people make at the retail level are produced in markets that are, of course, not perfectly competitive. They're not monopolies, and they're not monopolistically competitive either. Most of these things are oligopolies. And an oligopoly arises when a small number of large firms, like GTV, Zenith, Access, First Bank, Stackenberg, have all or most of the sales in an industry. When you compare it to monopolistic competition, oligopolies are similar in that there are slightly lower levels of production and higher prices that would be found in perfect competition. There are 2 types of behavior that you can see in oligopolistic markets, when firms collude and when they don't. So in this unit, we'll be looking at the models, the different models like the Stackenberg model and the Connot model, which assumes that the firms are not colluding. And then we'll also look at what happens when firms do collude. But first, some definitions. So, oligopoly. What are the features of an oligopoly? First of all, there's the interdependence of firms. That means that firms, unlike in monopoly or unlike in perfect competition, where they're solely focused on their core business, in oligopolies, firms are really interdependent. Almost every decision they make is based on what other people are doing, and they have to keep an eagle eye on every other player in the industry, and that really determines the actions that they will take. There's a 5 firm concentration ratio. So most economists agree that if there's 5 firms that are responsible for 50% or more of the sales in that industry, then it is an oligopoly. There should be some barriers to entry. And potential barriers include things like, really innovative technology, a patent, something that can only work at scale, so it keeps people out, huge amounts of capital required, or strategic actions taken by incumbents. So sometimes you can see incumbent companies overproducing to crash the market and prevent people from entering because of the difficulty that it would take to enter when they've already flooded the market with the product. There's usually some kind of product differentiation, sometimes not, but there should be some. In a lot of cases, there is product differentiation, although there can be homogeneous products in an oligopoly. Lastly, there's a possibility of collusion. So when there's a lot of large firms operating in a single space, there's the opportunity that they might speak to each other, and we'll be talking about that a bit later. Bobby Axelrod. So for anybody that has watched Billions, Billions is a game playing kind of series where you watch this billionaire Bobby Axelrod sort of compete with other hedge funds and the legal authorities, and he's always having to think about what his opponents are doing and what other people are doing in the industry and what the law enforcement agencies are doing and what the people that are investing in him are doing, and he always has to be one step ahead, and all of his actions are based over on reactions. They're basically reactions to what other people have done. So we'll be talking a bit more about Bobby Axelrod and Bobby Axelrod type behavior when we talk about game theory, because Billions is kind of based loosely around this game theory. But now, in order to understand this module fully, we'll just go through a few definitions. Price leadership. Price leadership is where all sellers in a market follow the price changes instituted by one particular seller. So in Nigeria, we used to see this in the cement industry. When Dangote reduces the price, all the other cement producers reduce their prices as well, and that's a form of price leadership. Price fixing is illegal in a lot of countries, and that's when all sellers in an oligopoly agree to charge the same price. We'll also be seeing a lot of reaction curves, also called best response curves. And this is a graph that shows the profit maximizing output of one firm in a duopoly, and a duopoly is where there's two major players or two players are being compared. So it shows the profit maximizing output of one firm in a duopoly given the output of another firm in a duopoly. So how one firm is going to react to another firm in a way that maximizes profit. And then we have price signaling. That's a form of implicit collusion. So there's explicit collusion and explicit collusion. Explicit is when it's obvious, there's a contract signed and everybody knows about it. Implicit is more subtle. And price signaling is a form of implicit collusion where one firm announces a price in the hope of other people following. We'll also be looking at a few payoff matrices. And a payoff matrix is used in game theory to illustrate possible outcomes for each of two players depending on the strategy that each one chooses. And there's a tactic collusion, which is collusion which takes place without the creation of a cartel. So all of these things I'll be talking about a bit more as we go through the module, but I just wanted to give you the definitions up front, so when I use those terms I don't have to continually explain them. So we'll start with the Connot model, and this is possibly the most famous model of oligopolies. And the Connot duopoly, also called Connot competition, is an oligopoly model where two firms produce a homogeneous good, so a good that's exactly the same. And each firm treats the output of its competitors as fixed. And they make their decisions in the Connot model simultaneously, so they make them at the same time. They don't have a chance to react to what somebody else is doing. So the Connot equilibrium is where each firm correctly decides how much a competitor is going to produce and sets its price accordingly. So a Connot equilibrium is when each firm, both firms, are doing the best that they can in terms of price in that particular market. And the Connot model focuses on output. So there's two types of models. Some focus on output and some focus on price. And then some focus also on the way the decisions are made, whether they're made simultaneously or whether they're made one after the other. And in the Connot model, of course, it's focusing on production, it's focusing on output, not price, and it's focusing on the fact that these decisions are made by the two firms simultaneously. So if you look to the graph, you'll see that market production is PQ. So market production is PQ and is equal to A minus BQ. And that's when Q is equal to Q1, which is a quantity produced by firm 1, plus Q2. So both firms will receive profits derived from a simultaneous decision made on how much to produce and based on their cost functions. And both companies are vying for sort of trying to get the maximum benefits. And these benefits are derived from both the maximum sales volume, which is a larger share of the market, and higher prices. Now, the problem in the Connot model stems from the fact that by increasing profitability through higher prices, they can lose their markets. Because people, if you're looking at homogeneous goods, these are goods that are exactly the same. People just won't pay higher prices for homogeneous goods. So when they raise their prices, they lose market share. So what Conot's approach does is maximize both market share and profitability by defining the optimum prices. And the price will be the same for both companies. Otherwise, the one with the lower price will obtain the full market share. So Conot's equilibrium is shown in the graph here. If they were colluding, they could achieve much higher profitability. But of course, if they were perfectly competitive, then they would achieve lower profitability, even though they'll be producing more quantity. So the Connot equilibrium is just in the middle, where they're not producing as much as they could under perfect competition, but at the same time, under collusion, they would have a much higher profitability because they would make the same amount of money for producing less. The second model we're going to talk about is a Stackenberg duopoly. And this is an oligopoly model in which one firm decides its output before the others. So I told you that, in the last slide that the Connot model is when producers decide at the same time, whereas the Stackenberg is a sequential game where one person decides before the other, and it's the person that decides before the other in terms of how much output they're going to produce that has the first mover advantage. So in the Stackenberg, one of the things that stand out in the Stackenberg model is that it gives an advantage to the first mover because the decisions are not made at the same time. One person makes the decision before the other, whereas in the Connot model, they have to make the decision at the same time. So this is an interesting module because it's whoever makes the first move that gets the market share, and the other person in the duopoly just has to follow. In Connot duopolies, the quantity sold is the same for both firms, whereas in Stackenberg duopolies, the quantity sold by the leader, of course, is greater than the quantity sold by the follower. But the important thing with Connot and Stackenberg is that they compete on basis of output and not price. So these are output models, not price models, and they're competing on who can sort of produce, who should produce what amount. So both Connot and Stackenberg are different in that Stackenberg is not a simultaneous decision. It's one firm making a decision before the other, whereas Connot, they're both making the decision at the same time. But the main similarity is that they're competing on the basis of output, not price. The third model of oligopoly is the Bertrand model, which is an oligopoly model in which firms produce homogeneous goods. Each firm treats the price of its competitors as fixed, and all firms decide simultaneously what to charge. So if you remember in the Connot model, they're homogeneous goods as well, but we were talking about output. We weren't talking about price. Whereas here, we are talking about price, not output. So it's based around price, and they decide, what simultaneously what to charge. So whereas in the Stackenberg model, it wasn't a simultaneous decision, it was one after the other. With the Berndt model, we're going back to a situation where all producers in the market are making a simultaneous decision, but not around output, but around price. And because they're making the decision around price, they end up in a situation where they're selling at marginal cost, basically, and they make no profit. So it's quite similar in a sense to perfect competition, where they're competing solely on price, not output. The Berndt model has been criticized because economists tend to argue that in homogeneous goods markets, that firms compete on output, not price. If you're selling exactly the same thing, then why would you be competing in price in the first place? And also they assume that sales are split equally. So the Berndt model assumes that sales are split equally between suppliers in the oligopoly, which is not necessarily true. But in the real world, beyond these models, actually oligopolistic firms sometimes, or maybe even often, have some degree of product differentiation. So market shares aren't just determined by price, but by differences in design, like Apple, differences in performance, like Toyota, and the durability of each product as well. So we've discussed quite a few models here. We've talked about the Connot model, we've talked about the Berndt model, and we've talked about the Stackenberg model. And as we go into a discussion of collusion, I just wanted to highlight some things about each model because it's easy to get them a bit confused or muddled up. So the Connot equilibrium tells us that an oligopoly, which produces identical products, will compete based on outputs. And that will mean that it will have a higher output than a monopoly, but a lower output than a Berndt oligopoly. And it will charge a lower price than a monopoly, but a higher price than a Berndt oligopoly. And I'm sure you can figure out why that is, because in a Berndt monopoly, where they're competing solely on price, it becomes, a bit of a race to the bottom, where price is the only differentiator, whereas Connot's equilibrium will compete on output. And Connot model also tells us that a firm in an oligopoly with a lower marginal cost will have higher output and will have higher market share. This is a competition based on output. And I've just put a table here to remind us of the differences between these three models. So the Stackenberg is a sequential decision-making move where one firm makes a decision after another firm and there's a first mover advantage for that. Connot, the decisions are made simultaneously, and with the Berndt decisions are made simultaneously as well. But in the Connot model, decisions are made simultaneously on the basis of outputs, whereas on the Berndt model, they're made on the basis of price. So the Kinked demand curve is, one of the most famous graphs in oligopolies, and the reason why it's so interesting and people, obsess over it is because it doesn't follow the normal laws of demand and supply. So in an oligopoly, people are not just reacting to consumers, they're reacting to their competitors. So there are different reactions to when you increase prices and when you decrease prices. So in an oligopolistic market, when you increase prices, you're probably going to really, really lose market share. So when prices are increased, there's a drastic loss in market share, especially in this model where we're assuming that the goods being sold are homogeneous. Because there's so many competitors that can take the person's place immediately and grab market share, because people have very, very elastic demands to homogeneous goods where there are lots of close substitutes. However, when you decrease prices or slash prices, you're in the short run, you're able to gain a lot of market share, but then the competitors come in and they also cut prices, and it ends up as a race to the bottom, because everybody's trying to cut prices and somebody's undercutting somebody, and that's what they call a race to the bottom, basically. So you find out that there's some degree of price rigidity in oligopolies, where even if, for instance, the marginal cost changes, the prices still stay the same, because nobody really wants to rock the boat. And profit maximization occurs when MR on the graph equals MC, which is at Q1. So what are the sort of criticisms, or how do we evaluate the Kinked demand curve? In the real world, even though things seem homogeneous, they're not that homogeneous. So for example, in the smartphone market, I know some Chinese phones that have even better functionality than an Apple phone, but still Apple is able to charge a premium because they're using a non-price competition. So that's one of the criticisms of the Kinked demand curve, that customers, even when some companies decide to cut their prices and make the cheapest smartphone ever, Apple doesn't. It stays expensive, and it uses sort of non-price competition to make people buy things. So that's brand loyalty argument, I guess. And then a lot of firms don't seek to maximize profits, especially not in the short term. So Amazon was loss making. I think they made a loss even after 20 years, but they were growing their market share, and they were also willing to cut prices and keep things very cheap, and just continue making losses as they gain market share. So these are some of the criticisms of the Kinked demand curve module, but I think it's still relevant in, like, commodities, for instance, things that there's no way that you can brand them. So for very homogeneous goods, you can still see those patterns. Now onto game theory. Game theory is so famous, and I mean, there's whole, almost degrees on game theory, and how to sort of react, how to think strategically, how to react to what your opponents are thinking. Game theory really attempts to take into consideration the interactions between participants and their behavior, to study the strategic decision making between rational individuals. So game theory really is a study, mathematical study of how people can react or might react to something that you do. And the most famous example of game theory is the prisoner's dilemma. And we hear about it all the time. So I'll give like a Nigerianized example of the game theory. Of the prisoner's dilemma. So two armed robbers are caught, and they're not caught in the house. It's just that there's no evidence that they actually robbed the house, but they're put in separate rooms and they're both told to confess. And if one confesses, like the armed robber A confesses, then he will end up with a shorter jail sentence, and the person that did not confess ends up with a longer jail sentence. If B confesses, then he ends up with a shorter jail sentence, and A ends up with the long jail sentence. If both confess, then they both end up with pretty long jail sentences. And if neither confess, there's no evidence to really go forward with the case, right? So they're both in panty, and they both have to try and figure out what the other one is going to do to try and get the best scenario for both of them. Obviously, the best scenario for both of them is that they don't confess. But can A really be sure that B is not going to snitch? And can B really be sure that A is not going to snitch? And that's the prisoner's dilemma, basically. How do you try and calculate the actions mathematically of your opponent, so you can take the best action for yourself? And when both companies or both both product sellers in an industry are doing the best that they can in relation and taking into consideration the actions of all of their opponents, then they're in a Nash equilibrium. So I think when we look at the Nigerian banking industry again, I think that, you know, they have a pretty homogeneous product, and all of them seem to be in a Nash equilibrium, right? They still charge us, like nobody is really trying to cut the e-banking fees, for instance, to zero, because they know that they will all be worse off for doing that. So they're kind of in a Nash equilibrium where they're all like kind of just trying to do the best that they can with the situation. And in that competitive situation, bearing in mind that they have competitors just doing the most that they can to ensure their profitability and productivity. And this kind of table that you can see here illustrating the prisoner's dilemma is a payoff matrix. So it's a diagram that shows all the different scenarios that could happen in a competitive situation. Collusion. So we've been talking all along with the Connot, with the Stackenberg, with the Vertan, with the kinked demand curve. We've been talking about situations where the firms don't actually collude and talk to each other. But another possibility for firms in an oligopoly is that they collude on price and set profit maximizing levels of output, and this maximizes profit for the industry. So in the example just here in the diagram, it shows that the industry was initially competitive, right? So it shows that they were just competing normally. However, if firms can agree, so if you look at Q, you can see when it was just a purely competitive firm, it's called QC. And you can see that they were producing at the price PC. And that was a competitive level, right? Nobody was talking to each other. They were all doing their thing. And they were like, you know, in that sort of equilibrium state where that was the best that they could do without colluding. However, if firms agree to collude, then it becomes very interesting, because instead of producing at that point where marginal profits, at that price where marginal cost crosses or sort of meets marginal revenue, they can actually go to a higher price. So as you can see here, when they collude, they can go to P2 and start making supernormal profits. It enables the entire industry, when they collude, to become more profitable. So at QC, they just made a normal profit. But if they can stick to their quotas and keep the price at Q2, they can make P2, they can make a supernormal profit. Collusion in most countries is illegal between industries, but it may also be hard to really find out if companies are colluding or not. And also, for collusion to be effective, there have to be barriers to entry. So cartel is a formal collusive agreement, and OPEC is an example of probably the most successful cartel. Nigeria is a member of OPEC, and they control the price of oil. I don't know if anybody watches Narcos, but I'll just briefly tell you the story about Narcos. It's on Netflix, and the guy in the picture is Mr. Felix. And he was one of the most successful drug traffickers ever in history. And why he was so successful is he was able to form a cartel to regulate the price and the market for cocaine in Mexico. And he was able to bring all the different, they called them plazas, that moved and did the logistic work for cocaine to all the different families, from the ones in Sinaloa to the ones on the border. He brought them all together under his organization, which he called La Federación. And he was able to control the price and control the supply and control the logistics for cocaine. So I mean, his story actually occupied two whole series of Netflix Narcos, because it was very interesting how this was a formal agreement between the major players in the cocaine industry to be able to move, and they also did weed. So I think they were into marijuana for some time, and then they moved on to cocaine. And it illustrated why some cartels work and some don't work. So I said that OPEC was the most significant sort of successful cartel in the world, and they control the price of oil. But the copper producing countries like Zambia, for instance, tried to form a CIPEC, which was a group of the copper producing companies in the world. However, that didn't work out so well. So the first point, and I'll be explaining that as why that didn't work out as well as OPEC's. So first of all, cartels must, when you form a cartel, then the collusion is explicit. Everybody knows that you're a cartel. I mean, OPEC have a website, they have meetings, everybody knows who the OPEC members are, they sign up to OPEC. So it's explicit, it's not implicit or tactic, it's open, everybody knows about it. But for a successful cartel, like Felix and like OPEC, you have to control most of the world's supply. So there are very few oil producing countries that are not part of OPEC, and they're not enough to control most of the world's supply. So OPEC is the cartel that controls most of the world's supply of oil, whereas with the copper producing countries, it wasn't, the members weren't enough to control most of the world's supply of copper. The demand must also be inelastic. So what that means is that the demand must not be price dependent. Everybody wants oil, and they'll buy it at any price because they need it to run their factories, they need it to drive their cars. There are not many close substitutes. However, with copper, if the price gets too high, people start substituting it with aluminium. So there are too many close substitutes, and also it can be recycled. So people, when the price gets too high, they start making out of like scrap metal and stuff. So the demand is pretty elastic for copper, where it's not for oil. If you want to form a cartel, it also has to be legally okay. So it has to be between countries, even though what Mr. Felix did was illegal. If you want to form a legal cartel, then it has to be in line with sort of the rules and regulations for the countries. And because OPEC was countries, there were no legal impediments because it's the countries that make the law. And there also has to be an ability of members to adhere. You see, in a cartel, there's always a temptation for somebody to go funny, because if you reduce the price just a tiny bit, then you get huge amounts of demand for that. So there's always the temptation for one of the members of the cartel to, try and be sneaky. And that was eventually what happened in Mr. Felix's case. Actually, the cartel turned on him, and the government, who was, turning a blind eye, I guess, to him, eventually caught up with him. And the cartel broke down. So there also has to be all, the ability of members to adhere to the terms and conditions of the cartel. Now, one of the interesting case studies, which I'd advise you to kind of read up more on Google, if you want to get a wider perspective, is a cartel and collusion in the Chinese airline industry. So a group led by a researcher called Zhang, used dummy airports to try and investigate, and models to try and investigate whether there was collusion in the Chinese airline industry, and he was sure that there was. It depended on the season, the type of airports used, whether they were busy or not, and on particular routes, and also on some of the tourist routes. He found what he thought was evidence of collusion. And the aim of all the airlines was to stay competitive against roads. Now, his hypothesis was that it was caused by weak antitrust laws in China. But sometimes, of course, like I said, one of the airlines would go funny and then it would disintegrate into a price war, and then it appeared that they would come back to the table and negotiate. So that was a really, really interesting study about the Chinese airline industry and whether or not there was evidence of collusion. A lot of countries have strong laws to prevent collusion, including fair trade laws, the antitrust laws of the USA, the anti-monopoly laws of Japan, and a lot of scrutiny around mergers and acquisitions to make sure that there's not too much influence, especially around mergers. So when two big players come together, there's not too much influence held in a single company.